Hi book friends, I'm Erin, and this is Erin Go Read. Hello and happy Vlogmas Day, whatever it is. This is going to be a video of my top 10 favorite books that were released in 2019. So not necessarily the favorite books that I've read in 2019, but the favorite books that were released in 2019. These not necessarily were the highest ranked books. There may have been some 2019 releases that I ranked higher at the time that I read them, or rated them higher at the time that I read them. But these are, I'm going to call like the stickiest books. So these are the books, I suppose, that have kind of left a sweet taste in my mouth months after I have read them. These aren't really any particular order. Many of them are so different from each other that it's hard to kind of compare them. But I think maybe the last three are probably my top three, also in no particular order among those three. So I'm going to start off with Machines Like Me by Ian McEwan. This is the first Ian McEwan I have ever read. We follow Charlie, a 30-ish young man who his job is basically just working from home on the stock market and just kind of doing as little as possible to get by. And he falls in love, or at least in lust, with a neighbor of his in his apartment building named Miranda. Charlie comes into a large sum of money through an inheritance, and he uses that money to buy one of the first atoms, a synthetic human. He wanted an Eve, but he had to settle for an Adam. Together, Charlie and Miranda program Adam. You can program like the personality traits, and so he lets her do half of it and he does half of it, so almost like them together are creating this synthetic human, or the personality of the synthetic human. It's set in the 80s in England, and their kind of alternative history has happened, and so you get little inklings of that in the background. So we follow this trio kind of with the backdrop of war and turmoil. So McEwan really kind of delves into some philosophical ideas about humanity by weaving together these historic events, these kind of alternative historic events, with some more current events and ideas. As I said, this was my first McEwan, and I'm looking forward to reading more. I have Atonement and Saturday. Those are the two that I own. Anyway, that is Machines Like Me by Ian McEwan. Next is a space opera novella by Becky Chambers. This is To Be Taught If Fortunate. Because this is a novella, I don't want to go deep into the plot, only kind of the premise. And there's this group of astronauts basically who wake up in space, and they've journeyed for, I want to say it's like 28 years or something like that before they get to the point where they are awakening. And there has been a technology has been developed called somoforming, where in order for the astronauts to be able to survive and be on the surface of these different planets, their bodies will somoform, meaning that their DNA actually changes to accommodate their survival needs on whatever destination planet they're heading. So it has less of an impact on, so this is going to have less of an impact on the planet where they are arriving to explore. And they're going to explore 4 Earth-like planets, looking for signs of life. Through these characters and their experiences, Chambers explores just kind of philosophical ideas about knowledge and what it is to seek knowledge, and for what purpose are we seeking knowledge. My favorite part of this book was the way that Chambers emotes the absolute joy that these astronauts experience as they make these new discoveries, and it just made me want to scoop up some pond scum and go look under a microscope. Next up is My Name is Monster by Katie McHale, and I'm going to caution you, this book is not a book for people who have to have all of the answers kind of tied up neatly with a bow. There are certainly like tributaries that kind of you get a glimpse at that you will not get the answers to, but I also found that was a little bit part of the beauty of the book as well. So I could definitely see how that might be really irritating for some, but for me, it was part of the beauty of the book. This is kind of a post-apocalyptic survival story. Our main character, Monster, works at a seed vault at the time of basically a humanity-destroying world event. And she then swims across to the shore of Scotland and is just kind of trying to survive. She's exploring what is there and try to set up a home camp for herself, and we get glimpses throughout the book as to what happened in the past to cause the current scenario, although that's not necessarily the important part. The important part is Monster's journey, and then when she meets a little girl in the city, she thinks that she's the only survivor, and then she meets this young girl and kind of takes her in, and Monster renames herself Mother, and now she names the little girl Monster. And so we have Mother and Monster, and Mother tells Monster that Mother means creator and Monster means survival. And then, so for a good part of the story, we have Mother as our narrator, and then, or who was Monster at the time, and then the perspective switches to Monster, young Monster. I know it's confusing, and we now see things through her eyes, and we get more accurate glimpses, perhaps, at Mother and her character and who she is and what motivates her. And we see their relationship, kind of the codependency. And imagine if you're the only two humans you believe to be alive, the codependence that would happen there. There is a great emphasis on language because Mother has to teach Monster language and how to speak. And given their very limited kind of world that they exist in, the language you learn is really context dependent. So, for example, if you've never been to a city, then there are probably all sorts of words related to a city that you're not going to know. If you grew up in a beach area, then you're not going to need to know the words for bus and skyscraper and train. And so that's just not that is relevant to this, but it's the language aspect is. And so Monster has to kind of become her own woman. So I just absolutely love this, and I recommend it. The biggest book on this list, and I believe the biggest book that I read all year probably, is The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, and I just love this beautiful cover. There's so much going on in this book to try to sum it up. We have an epic fantasy story here with dragons and magic and a queendom and a really well developed. What I think I love about this so much, without really even going into the plot, because you probably know what this is about or look it up. What I think is so beautiful about this book is the world building and the really rich culture that it surrounds it. There are legends and lore and myths that are explored and stories that are told that relate to the reason that a certain culture does something, believes something. And we have these two major cultures that are split from each other, and the worlds kind of collide, and how they're going to be able to deal with that kind of for the better of everyone or not, to the destruction of everyone. So highly recommend this. I also would really love to read, I have Bone Season, and I want to say there are 3 books in the Bone Season books out, and there are going to be more, so that's one that I look forward to getting to as well. Then we have the Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead, and this is based on a true story of a reform school in Florida in the 60s, and this graveyard was uncovered of these boys that had been killed or died in the process of being reformed at this school. In the story, we follow a very bright young Elwood Curtis, who is unjustly sent to this boys' reform school, and the absolute atrocities of being there. There's a section for the white kids, there's a section for the black kids, and then there's one particular character, I can't remember his name, but he's Hispanic. I think he's Mexican. It was almost as comic relief. He would show up every now and then, and the adults kind of didn't know what to do with him because he wasn't white or black, he was brown, and so they kept switching him back and forth. So that's kind of this comic relief to this really harrowing story of these boys, and particularly of Curtis having to live at this reform school. And Whitehead does something that I really appreciate. Another author that I can think of that does this is Jesmyn Ward, where the story they're telling and the events that are happening are horrific, but it's told in this really beautiful prose. And so it's almost like a conflicting feeling when you're reading it, because it's so beautiful, but it's so terrible at the same time. It's a short, great read. Get to it if you haven't already. Then we have The Far Field by Madhuri Vijay. I actually read this in December of 2018. Sometimes with Book of the Month Club, you can get an early release, and that was the case with this. And I think I read this like the last week of 2018. But it did come out in January of 2019. In this, we follow a young Indian woman who comes from a middle class, pretty well-to-do family. I think her father owns a tire factory. We watch her really struggle with grief and kind of who she is and what she's supposed to be doing in life. And what I found is because of her pretty secure place in life, as far as she's quite privileged in that she kind of has the ability to just kind of waffle and figure out what she wants to do with herself, she ends up going to find this friend of her mother's that used to come visit during her childhood, find out more about him and his relationship with her mom, and she ends up going up to Kashmir at the time of, during the time of war there, and she kind of explores this man's life and his relationship with her mother and who her mother was and her father and just her whole family. And it's really a story about her discovering herself in the context of her life. I found it so entertaining and, again, really beautifully written. Next we have How Not to Die Alone by Richard Roeper, and this is it's an adult contemporary, and our main character, Andrew, is living a lie. He has a government job. I can't remember what the agency is called, but basically they go in after someone has died in their home and they have no obvious next of kin, and so they have to go in and kind of inspect the house and find if they can find any form of correspondence, an address book or something, to find a next of kin in order to inform them, and then also see if there are valuables that can be sold at auction in order to help cover the cost of a funeral for this person. Andrew feels kind of a duty to attend the funeral of the people whose homes he goes to. However, he is living a bit of a lie, because when he went in to interview for this job, kind of in order to avoid an awkward conversation, he just agrees that yes, he's married with kids, and so then his coworkers have no reason to believe that he doesn't, and he just continues to live this life talking about, oh, the kids did this and it was so funny, or oh, we're going on a family trip or whatever, always talking about the family as if they actually exist. And the longer this goes on, the harder it's going to be to kind of actually tell the truth. He doesn't really have much going for him in his life. He doesn't have this family that he wishes that he did have. And then Peggy comes along. Peggy gets hired at the agency, and he is kind of training her out in the field and in the office, and they become friends. As Andrew develops this relationship with her, he kind of sees the things that he really is pretending to have that he could actually have with another human if it wasn't for this lie. And so then we see how he kind of tackles that. Will Peggy and Andrew get together? Will he confess to everyone about the lie that he's been telling, and how will that go down? All that kind of stuff. And I absolutely loved it. I just found it really charming and endearing, and sometimes you just want to shake people in this book, but I absolutely loved it. We then have Lanny by Max Porter. This is a short novel, just over 200 pages, and it is very fairy tale-like. So we follow a boy named Lanny, and he's quite unique, and we get perspectives from everyone else about who Lanny is and what makes him so special. We also have the presence of Dead Papa Toothwort, who is kind of this like boogeyman consciousness of the village kind of thing. I don't want to go really into the actual plot of the story, as it is such a short story, and I don't want to give anything away there, but reading this is really an experience. So it's, first of all, it is beautifully written, and then we have like the words will kind of dance around the page sometimes, and that's part of the telling of the story. When we're in the perspective of Dead Papa Toothwort, we get this like choral voice of what the people in the town are thinking and saying. It is beautifully written, atmospheric, creepy, and really, I think, an experience. We then have one of the only YA books that I read this year. I think this is certainly for any audience, and this is Deb Coletti's A Heart in the Body in the World. Annabelle is a runner on her high school's track and cross-country teams, and something has happened in the past, and she literally starts running from it. So her her grandfather ends up kind of being her support crew and in order to make sure she's safe, and follows her along in an RV so she has a safe place to stay and someone to check on her, make sure she's safe every night. And as she begins this run, she is then kind of processing and dealing with what it was that happened, and then we are brought in slowly on what that happens. There are other people in her life who end up contributing to the run and the processing of this and all, and it's just such a beautiful book. I think that everybody should read it. I don't want to give too much away about what's actually happening, because I think it just needs to be experienced. And last up, we have Nothing to See Here by Kevin Wilson. I absolutely loved this book. It was so fun. So Lillian and Madison were roommates for 1 year at a very prestigious boarding school. Madison comes from a very well-to-do, kind of like historically important family, and Lillian, not so much. Lillian ends up kind of taking the heat for Madison in something that happens at this boarding school. Lillian and Madison's father pays her mother off in order for Madison to stay at the boarding school and Lillian to be expelled in Madison's place, essentially. Years later, they've kept in contact just through letters here and there, nothing too personal, but Lillian always loves the idea that Madison is there, and she maybe has some kind of unexplored underpants feelings for Madison, and this kind of keeps her interested. So Madison writes to Lillian asking her, please come and stay with us. I need to ask you a favor, but I need to see you in person. So Lillian agrees. Madison is recently married to a very prominent man in politics. He's kind of in line for Secretary of State. And they have a child together, a young boy. I want to say he's like 2. And then, but what's the guy's name? Madison's husband Jasper also has a set of twins from a previous marriage, and their mother has recently died, and the twins are to come live with Jasper and Madison and Timothy, the young boy. So Madison is asking Lillian, can you come and help kind of be the governess for the twins and help them to kind of integrate into our family life? It's going to be a difficult transition. So she's like dangling this carrot of this really beautiful, opulent life and this pretty easy job, she thinks. And Lillian's like, what are you not telling me? Something is up. Well, just the fact that these kids happen to spontaneously combust when they feel a strong emotion. So despite that, Lillian is not scared off, and she agrees and stays. And her job then her job then is to help take care of these kids who are grieving, who are hurting, and who are likely to burst into flames at any moment. So her job is to kind of try to keep them from bursting into flames, from burning anything else out. The kids are not hurt when they burst into flames, but they certainly can hurt others and can burn the house down. Lillian, who is not a very kind of emotionally adept, socially adept person, has to kind of tackle this with these kids and figure out their triggers and what's going on with them, and she really comes to care for these kids, and we see her kind of we see her really change. We get to see her grow into that role, and then how it is that they're going to be able to be integrated into the family. And what I think is done so well is just the idea of these kids bursting into flames being this really graphic representation of emotion and emotional trauma in a child. Also, what is kind of humorous about this book is that you have this everything else in the story is completely normal. It's a normal setting. This is a normal family. There's no sci-fi element except for the fact that these kids just burst into flames, and it's just like almost accepted that that's the thing that happens, although it's clearly odd and different, and could be a big problem for Jasper's political career if it gets out that he has kids that catch on fire. But I just absolutely adored the character. I highly recommend Kevin Wilson's Nothing to See Here. Okay, this is quite a heavy, awkward stack, but these are my top 10 2019 releases that I've read so far. I have many more 2019 releases that I'm looking forward to read. I'd love to know if you've read any of these books, or are you looking forward to them? Do you agree with my opinions on these, that these were some of the best 2019 releases? Thank you for watching. See you around the tube.